Hey everybody, my name's Alex and this is Bento Radio. Now before we get started, I have very good news. And also the normal starter podcast stuff, but I want to start with this. So, over the past year, I have been toiling away on my own to build something that I've always wanted to have. And that is a way to take the kind of notes that people talking about anime on the internet tend to take anyway, but tend to do in more disparate ways. And everybody has their own way, and I'm not saying that the way I've come up with is perfect, or even the best for you or anybody who talks about anime on the internet, other than me, but I wanted a way to do this. I also wanted a way to have a kind of companion when I'm watching something that I know I want to talk about. Even watching something that I don't know that I want to talk about, where I could take notes on the episode I'm watching and keep track of that in the same place that I'm keeping track of the episodes I'm watching and the shows I'm watching and stuff like that. And I also threw in a seasonal watch calendar and the discovery thing and all that stuff. My point is, I am making an app. And that app is currently in beta testing right now, which is a beta release essentially, and you can go mess with it if you have an iPhone. I'm only doing this for iOS because I'm only one person and I'm not a tech reviewer, so I don't have multiple phones to target and really nail stuff down like that. But anyway, I'm making an app and it's currently in beta testing. I'm not quite super hard sure on when it will come out in wide release, but for now, I've got a good number of people who have already signed up to test this thing and mess with it. And if you do want to mess with it, you do want to try something that's maybe a little less checklisty of a way to keep track of what you're watching and a little bit more involved, I'll leave a link. There'll be a link to get into the beta on the site. That site, of course, is bento-box.ghost.io. That's the site that's always in the description of this podcast, whether you're watching it here on YouTube or you're listening to it in your podcast player of choice. That link will always be there. It will also be in the description of the YouTube channel and the description of the podcast proper. My point is, you can find the link everywhere. If you go there, there should be a page in the top navigation that says something like software or app or whatever, and you can click it and there'll be a button there. I will make sure this happens that gives you access to the beta via test flight. You'll do it through test flight. If you don't know what that is, you'll figure it out pretty quickly. It's pretty dirt simple easy. But that's my big thing. The other stuff is, if you really like the podcast, of course, be sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're taking it in. If that's here on YouTube, scroll down just below the video and hit the subscribe button and the notification bell that will let you know when new episodes drop. But if you're wondering, I try to keep it strictly to a drop time of about 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday night. And if you're listening to it, you can subscribe to me in whatever app you're hearing me in right now. If you really love the podcast, be sure to give it a 5-star review. If you're on YouTube, you can leave a comment. And if you are so inclined, you can share the show with your friends. That really helps me get out there, so to speak. So definitely go do that. Once again, if you are over the moon with this thing that I'm doing here, go check out bento-box.ghost.io for articles I've written, more detailed little posts that I do that accompany every single one of these episodes, and social links and all that jazz. So definitely go check that out. Now, without further ado, let's jump into what we're talking about this week. And that's a little film that came out in Japan in 2020 and came out here in 2022 and in a very limited release in about only maybe 350 theaters, and is from the studio that brought you things like Keep Your Hands Off Eizouken and things like Dan-to-Dan. And this year we'll be bringing you the latest edition of Ghost in the Shell, and that's Studio Science SARU. And that film is called Inu-Oh. Now I'm going to pass it over to to give us a succinct and good plot description so we can get that out of the way. Take it away,
The film opens in modern-day Japan before shifting back to the 14th century, shortly after the fall of the Heike clan. A young boy named Tamona survives a shipwreck tied to a cursed sword discovered on the ocean floor. The trauma blinds him and leaves him orphaned. He is taken in by a guild of blind biwa priests who recite the epic tale of the Heike. Elsewhere, a child is born horribly disfigured, with elongated limbs, a mask-like face, and an inhuman appearance. Believed to be cursed, he is named Inu-Oh and hidden from society by his father, a no performer who treats him as an embarrassment. Years later, Tomona and Inu-Oh meet and recognize in each other a shared isolation. Tomona's music awakens something in Inu-Oh, and together they begin performing stories of the Heike that have been forgotten or deliberately erased. During their first major performance, Inu-Oh's body partially transforms. One of his deformities disappears. Each time they perform and restore another lost story, another part of Inu-Oh's body becomes whole.
With the plot synopsis out of the way, I want to talk about in-groups and out-groups a little bit here, because I think it's important to my thoughts about this film and you contextualizing it if you've never seen it. Which odds are that you may not have, because it didn't have a super huge release in the theater in America, and even worldwide it only grossed under $1 million, which, to give you an idea, that's way behind things like One Piece Film Red or any of the Demon Slayer movies or anything like that. This release was much more akin to something like an art house release, and this was also before the mega stardom of Studio Science SARU, which really came about because of Dandadan. Dandadan is like Science SARU's big mainstream knockout of the park. Before this, they had films like The Night's Short Walk On Girl or series like Akami Galaxy, and those are much more experimental. They're still great. If you haven't seen any earlier Science SARUs than Dandadan, I encourage you to not only watch this movie, but watch any of their stuff. It's all fun as hell, and it's all really fun, artsy animation. And it really is animation with capital A, not just anime in the way that you're thinking of it. If you look at this film, looks a lot different than your typical anime. But the thing I want to talk about here is in-groups and out-groups. So to do that, I want to call everybody back to a Super Bowl halftime performance. Not the one we just had, although that one was great, the Bad Bunny one, but the one from the year before, the Kendrick Lamar one. After he did that cheesesteak to the camera and said, "Say Drake," there was a moment when there were a bunch of people dancing on stage, and a bunch of famous people were mixed in there, and one of the famous people was Serena Williams. She was doing a dance called the Crip Walk, which she is famous for doing on the court when she would win a match in tennis, when she still used to be a tennis player. And she would get flagged by the refs for it, and she actually later said in an interview, if I'd done the version of the Crip Walk that I was doing on stage at the halftime show on the court when I was competing, they would have suspended me and called it a draw. Like, that's how unallowed it was. That's how much they pushed back against that kind of celebration, that kind of expression of celebration. But that dance was created by a double amputee dancer in the 40s and 50s, named, I think it's Henry, quote-unquote, Crip Hurd. And it was later adapted by the actual Crips, the infamous West Coast gang, in the 70s, where it becomes the thing you see. But originally, when the dance was done, it was done with one foot, because Henry Hurd only had one leg. Now, I say all this not just for a fun trip down memory lane, but to tell you that you may not have known that. And you can go look that up, and it's been out there, obviously. As soon as something is that dance, he was on television doing that dance. You can find the clips from old 1940s and 50s black and white footage of him doing that dance, and it is remarkably a thing that we all recognize as the Crip Walk, except with one leg. Time and authority and power have a way to stand off the edges of things and either push them to the back or adapt them and bring them into the fold to make full use of them, in a manner of speaking. And if you follow this movie, that's what a lot of this movie is about. This movie is about ostensibly the form of Japanese dance and performance that became Noh theater. And the people who came up against what was already established and what was accepted primarily by the people in power as the peak of entertainment. And it tells the story of two young people, two notably disabled young people. A young boy named Tomona, who was part of a small family that dove for discarded Heike treasure, and I'll get to the Heike in a second, but they dove for Heike treasure off the coast and in a poor village, and nobles show up in the very beginning of the film. And by the way, spoiler alert for all of Inu-Oh. If you want to watch Inu-Oh, I encourage you to do it. It's on Netflix now. You can also get, I believe I own a digital copy of it, but because I saw it in theaters in 2022 when it came out. And I immediately got it on digital as soon as I could, because I do love this film. Basically, Tomona is the son of a diver who's training him how to dive, and Tomona is assisting him in diving to make a living for their family. And nobles show up and they say, we want you to find this thing. And we want you to... So it's considered to be this regalia that will prove that the shogun... it is the true emperor. Because at this point in time, the country is split control between the north and the south, between the emperor and the shogunate. And so nobles from the shogunate come down to this sleepy, not very successful or rich fishing village, and contract this family to go out and dive and find this regalia, which ends up being a sword. And the sword is cursed. And the whole thing becomes a debacle. The father draws the sword kills him by literally splitting him in half, and it takes Tomona's sight at a young age. So now Tomona is fatherless, and his father is fatherless and blind. And the people responsible for it, the emissaries of the shogunate, nowhere to be found. They freak out, they leave, they wipe their hands of the whole thing. To them, it's like it never happened. This is a great version of what I was just talking about. The people at the bottom are oftentimes used by the people at the top for a kind of access that people at the top can't get or aren't willing to put themselves in harm's way to get. And then if it goes wrong, the people at the top just wipe their hands clean of it and walk away. And if it goes right, they take all the credit. Technically, they'll have paid somebody for a service, but they'll usually have paid way less, and oftentimes they're picking people to do certain things because they need the money. They don't have the luxury of saying, well, no, Brit, jump up your own ass and die. I can wait for a version of this that pays more. And people at the top know that. Even if not on purpose, they know it instinctually. They're taught it, even. And so that's the opening of the film. And you follow Tomona for the first maybe little while of the film. I don't want to say the first third, because I've seen maybe the first quarter of the film, as he falls in with a group of Biwa monks and starts to tell the story of the Heike. Here's why I want to talk about the Heike, because the Heike are ever present in this film, but also they have nothing to do with it. They were one of the two powerful clans that produced an emperor, even, in the 11th and 12th century, and who were beat right out of the power seat by another clan that ended up ruling after them and beyond. And those stories were turned into the tales of the Heike, which became cautionary tales of hubris. But if you ever heard the story, history is written by the winners, then you know that framing probably isn't super true. And so Tomona falls in with these Biwa monks, and these blind Biwa monks, so they're blind like him. He learns how to play the Biwa. He becomes a low-level but deeply talented performer, and he makes a life for himself, ultimately. And the film does this in a really excellent way. It shows his father as a ghost following him and encouraging him to embrace the anger that he has towards the establishment around him, towards the power structure that killed his father and took his sight. So you have our first disabled character. And then, after a point, he meets another young person, roughly his same age, who has no name and is horrifically deformed. And I want to call out who eventually takes the name Inu-Oh, because he would never give it a name in the first place. But this film does, that you don't notice unless you're looking for it and you know what it means, is Inu-Oh scares people with his deformed face. He scares people to kind of like give himself space and like, you know, show people what's what and all that stuff. But you never see his face until it's perfect. You never see his face until it's no longer deformed. You never... The show shows others lingering on it, but it never lets you, the viewer, linger on it. It makes plainly clear that he's deeply deformed. He's not the shape that humans should be. At the very beginning of the movie, he's really squat. He's got a mile-long arm, like an arm that's like 5 to 10 times the length it should be. He wears a gourd mask over his face. He wears masks over his face. He wears, actually, interestingly enough, no masks over his face for the majority of the film, because his face is deformed. And he goes over, the film makes sure to show you him going over, like, his deformities. He's like, I've got this weird arm, I've got scales on my back, my eyes and mouth aren't where they should be. He goes down this list of, like, things that are wrong with him. And there was this belief that has continued to inform Japanese class structure to this day, that people who are disabled or physically or severely physically different in some way were possessed by or were in fact themselves yokai or demons or or vengeful spirits or what have you. And oftentimes this led to people who were like very different being locked away in those like big lacquer prisons that you see in shows like JJK. Like when you see, so perfect example, when you see the 2 girls that Geto pals around with until they die in the Shibuya incident. Spoilers for JJK, for that season of JJK. When you first meet them, they're being held in this, like, embedded in a cliff, big, lacquered, wooden prison cell. Those weren't just prison cells. Oftentimes they held people who Japanese people believed were possessed by evil spirits or were evil spirits, or however you want to put it. And this included disabled people. Another good example of this is in a different anime film called Miss Hokusai, or Sarutobi Miss Hokusai. And in that film, the main character's sister is blind, and so she lives with, I believe it's she lives with Buddhist monks, with Buddhist nuns in a Buddhist temple. And the reality is she could still live with, Hokusai and her daughter, with her father and her sister, but culturally it feels like there's something spiritually wrong there, so she's kept in a religious in a religious place instead. And eventually that does go bad on everybody, and it is quite sad in that movie. But my point is that, like, the way that people are treating Inu-Oh in this film, and the way that people treat even Tomona in the film, is a real thing that happened. And when I was watching them introduce Inu-Oh for the first time in the movie, I had a flashback to the first scenes of Naruto, when you see Naruto in a very similar way running around and causing havoc just to get attention. And a lot of the beliefs that, a lot of the characteristics line up between Inu-Oh and Naruto. They're both possessed, they're both cursed. Naruto is literally cursed to carry Kurama, the nine-tailed fox, inside of him. Inu-Oh is cursed by a entity that you've come to find out later was kind of engaged by his father. But in exchange for his father being able to, like, acquire and maintain notoriety and fame. But what starts to solve Inu-Oh's curse is not just performing, but performing specifically the stories of the Heike. The stories of the Heike that aren't told, though. Because the stories that are being told are, once again, being told very, like, lovingly and slowly, and, like, it looks like No Theater that you're actually kind of familiar with if you've seen No Theater. But the stories that Inu-Oh and that Tomowari, which is ultimately the name of the troupe that Tomona founds to, like, kind of be the herald and backing to Inu-Oh, start to tell, are these stories of, like, glory and, you know, battle and power. They are much more balanced than the stories being peddled by the official sources. And not only are they much more balanced, but the performances are, all the performances have a punk show vibe. Does that make any sense? Like, my personal favorite, like, major performance is the kind of the first time they perform these stories on and under the bridge, which is a song called in the soundtrack, which you can get on Apple Music, by the way. You can get on most streaming platforms, I would imagine, at this point, by the way. Fantastic soundtrack. Called Burial Mound of Arms. And they do a really good job in the film of showing you the contrast between the traditional No Theater performance, and there's a different, like, pre-No Theater name for the art form here that I'm not remembering, so I'm just using No as, like, a stand-in for that, because it's what becomes No Theater. But the contrast in the audience watching that, and the emperor watching that, and the emperor's wife watching, and the shogun's wife watching that, not the emperor, but the shogun and the shogun's wife watching that, and considering that. And along with the, like, people who crowded in to see the performance, and the experience of the people watching the performance put on by Inu-Oh and Tomowari. And the two couldn't be more different. One is super restrained, super traditional, like, you know, the kind of, like, low, whining, like, Japanese flute playing that you can probably hear in the back of your head if you've seen enough anime right now. That's the traditional side. The Inu-Oh and Tomowari side is a rock opera. And it's a rock opera that is espousing the kind of greatness of the Heike in a way that is not... that's certainly not condoned by the people who presumably are the winners of that, are beneficiaries of the winners of that conflict, who were not, as everyone knows, the Heike. And what transpired after that is this portrait of, not of a emperor losing control, not of a shogunate losing control, but a shogun who's just on the edge of losing control, who's just on the, like, who's at the beginning of something that could spiral out and mean that he doesn't get to be in power. And by the way, he's still waiting on those regalia all these years later. Little do they know, the sword is there. Just nobody wants to touch it because it killed a man and blinded a kid. Who, oh yeah, it has become one of the performers performing the forgotten and ignored, much more balanced and truer stories of the Heike. And what you see is the, like, fun and incredible amount of celebration and awesomeness that is happening all around these performances, all around these Inu-Oh chapters, as Inu-Oh calls them when he performs. And then you get a short scene where the shogun is like, we need to ban these things. They are a problem. They are the start of a cultural schism that we will lose control of. And he's not wrong. People in power who fear cultural change aren't wrong about that cultural change. People in power don't want to give it up. And part of that, they try to make it so incredibly hard to break out of their box that they want for you. This is true of anybody or any power system. It's very hard to get out of it. And that can be a good thing, that can be a bad thing. It's just what it is. But in this case, the shogunate want to shut this down because it's not... The Heike are... The Tales of the Heike is meant to be a cautionary device about overextending your reach. It's meant to be a device that helps you know your place. That's why the Biwa monks are allowed to perform the Heike tales. And encouraged to, because they let, yes, as the one Biwa monk who's Tomono's kind of father figure for much of the film says, like, they do it to soothe the souls of the Heike, but in practice what they're doing is they're sounding a warning bell to anybody who thinks they can do what the Heike attempted. And they're helping keep a kind of power structure in place. And what Tomowari and Inu-Oh are doing by doing these street performances is they're creating culture that is opposing what is there. So a perfect example of this is the song American Idiot by Green Day was written in the early 2000s, directly opposing the Bush presidency. It has since been repurposed to oppose the Trump presidency. But the idea was that they wanted to make a song that was popular enough where everybody would always ask them to play it, and they would get to tell anybody in power they didn't agree with to go kick rocks. And that is totally what they did. They performed American Idiot as part of their opening performance to the halftime show, to the Super Bowl this year. And indeed, they said in that version of it, they said, I don't want to be part of the MAGA agenda. And we're bleeped by the Super Bowl. It's just, and that's kind of the same playbook Inu-Oh and Tomowari are playing here. And eventually they become more and more popular, and there's a kind of distance growing between Inu-Oh and Tomona. And part of the reason this distance is happening is because as they perform more and more chapters of these stories, Inu-Oh is getting more and more human, or he's coming out of being disabled. In one of the very first scenes you meet him, he does a little dance alongside what you ultimately understand to be his father's dance troupe, which is very famous and favored by the Shogun. And that dance causes his legs to grow to what they should be. And then in the Burial Mound of Arms performance, his arm shortens to be the right length. And then eventually, the scales on his back disappear. And every time he gains something from this, he becomes more flamboyant and more rock star-esque and more open with what he's willing to show in the world. He's always, once he no longer has to worry about the scales on his back, you see him enjoying a drink with patrons, with rich patrons, in amongst the cherry blossoms, shirtless. He's still wearing the mask, but he's shirtless now. And in the entire film, not only do they not show you his face, but they show you his perspective from inside the mask on the rest of the world, pretty intermittently, until it doesn't feel necessary anymore. But my point is that he is gaining a kind of recognition as a personhood that Tomona's not gaining. And there starts to be a little bit of a distance there. A little bit of a sad but understandable distance, but they don't ever really, Tomona and Inu-Oh don't ever leave each other by choice. They are forced by the power structure that tries to absorb them to not. Because the difference between Inu-Oh and Tomona ultimately ends up being that the world did both of them dirty. In Inu-Oh's case, he was, as an unborn infant, given to a demon, so his father could become a famous no-theater troupe instructor, and could write what would become the definitive tales of the Heike. And in his quest to get those stories, he cut down on much of the Biwa monks. Because the Biwa monks, who were the ones who went to the hidden villages of the Heike and found their stories and brought them into culture by performing them. So here you have a much more privileged person, not just taking advantage of people, but of outright killing them for their cultural product, so he can make the money and the fame himself. And then the next step is he gives his firstborn child, he gives his first and only born child over. And then that child eventually meets up with somebody who is directly affected by the worlds that had been created. And that child has been irreversibly scarred, both emotionally and physically, by the power structure that wants to remain in power. And he sees a way to help a new friend, somebody who is also suffering, and he finds out through the course of the story that the reason that his now lifelong friend and collaborator has suffered because of a power structure that did him dirty too. And so ultimately, by the end of the film, Inu-Oh is brought into the fold by the Shogun, and the Shogun says, you should ditch the Biwa player, you're never to talk to him again. And if you do, it would be unfortunate because he would lose his head. I would hate to see that happen to you. And Inu-Oh all at once is like, oh, fuck. And when you see him do that, you see a hood on that he's never done before. A fake, plastered stage smile that he's never had before, because he knows what's happening to him. He's being kept because the Emperor has become amused by the fact that he is technically the best performer. The only problem is what he performs. And as for Tomona, who can't let go of the fact that he was robbed of his life, whatever it may have been, by the people in power, so much so that he was forced to strip away his name and ultimately try to perform another chapter of the alternative and more true, it seems, stories of the Heike, who, by the way, are like all throughout this movie. This movie is not about the Heike, but they are the cultural mechanism that all the characters are turning on constantly. And it's telling that the Heike were the losers. That people at the bottom are repurposing the real stories of other people who were on the losing end of a conflict to regain some kind of, not just cultural cachet, but some kind of power. And not even that much. The goal of Tomina and of Inu-Oh was not to disrupt anything. It was to tell these stories, entertain people, gain some kind of notoriety. For Inu-Oh, it was to become whole again. And in doing so, and this is really common in any kind of artistic expression that takes hold in real ways, in doing so, they become this kind of sounding board for an attempt to change everything from the bottom up. So I'm going to go on a weird little tangent here. But Gyaru girls, the very almost hyper Barbie-esque fashionista women in Japanese culture, are interesting because they are challenging traditional beauty standards for Japan. And a lot of people have problems with them for that. They are fetishized immensely for that. But they also are incredibly... You can see this in anime, certainly, with characters like Momo. With characters like Momo and characters like Mirin Kitagawa. But they are incredibly independent. They're incredibly internationally aware in a way that does not help the powers that be. And they are they have an incredible amount of emotional and sexual freedom that is not a thing that a very traditionally sexist culture like Japan likes to think about. And that's why lots of Japanese people are made uncomfortable by them. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here with Inu-Oh. And the movie eventually goes on to tell you that Inu-Oh was the most famous performer, went on to become one of the most famous, but many of his original and initial performances were lost because they were deemed not fit for performance by the powers that be. And so they were lost. And that's what this movie is about. It's about a startup of culture that is crushed and then ultimately found in the modern day. Because this movie, almost called it a show, but this movie starts in the modern day. It starts with you seeing, from Tomina's perspective, a traffic intersection after the cherry blossoms have fallen. And it returns to that traffic intersection by the end of the film. And that traffic intersection is much believed to be a metaphor for the afterlife for both Tomina and Inu-Oh. But in the very last performance of the film, of a piece called Dragon Commander, Inu-Oh and Tomina realize that Inu-Oh isn't changing, and that they don't know why. They don't know what story they're not telling. And their goal is to tell the story of the Heike and spread those stories, and for Inu-Oh to be able to heal. And Tomina is the one who metaphorically goes looking for the story that they're missing. And he comes across his own and he says, no, I know that story. Tell me the one I don't know. And he sees Inu-Oh's story. He sees the fact that Inu-Oh, like him, was betrayed by the entire structure of their lives, even before he was born, all in the name of his father being more famous. And ultimately, his father's versions of the stories are the only ones that Inu-Oh is allowed to perform. And the power structure assimilates him and disregards Tomina. Which is, to be fair, a real bummer on this film. The last third of this film is a real bummer. It brings you way down. Because up until that point, it is disabled people getting it. For disabled people kicking ass and taking names and starting a cultural revolution, not because they want to or even have to, but because it just was right to start in the first place, and they just have to be at the center of it. And in just as an uncaring way as both the shogunate and Inu-Oh's father cast them off initially. They, in the case of Inu-Oh, casually suggest that he come into the fold. In the case of Tomino, as if it was nothing, kill him in the streets. And I think that's really important, because, as I said towards the beginning of this podcast, history is written by the winners. Only the winners have to maintain that. They have to hope that the story of the losers doesn't get found out. I'm going to end it with this as a story because I think this is a really important story. But I went to the South a couple of years ago. I live on the East Coast, but I went to the South a couple of years ago, and I went specifically to Montgomery to see the Memorial for Peace, the Memorial and the accompanying museum for the Memorial in Peace and Justice. And that thing is horrifying. But at the same point, if there's anything you should probably go see in this country, it's probably that. The Statue of Liberty is great. Ellis Island is great. The Grand Canyon is breathtaking. But that memorial, those girders that are hanging endlessly, is the story of the cruelty of this country towards a class of people that people aren't comfortable with. And perhaps the most enlightening and disturbing part of the experience, other than walking through this thing as a biracial person, I'm half black, half white, and just openly weeping. And I wasn't the only person who was just like, oh my god. Most people in it were. But eventually you come to the end, and there are piles of girders. And at first you're like, what is this? Have they just not hung these yet? I don't think I can take the fact that there's more of these to go. No, they're duplicates. A few states have accepted them, but at the time I got there, most states hadn't. Even the states you think would, even the more liberal states, hadn't. And it was this cruel reminder that they set up on purpose that nobody wants to admit to it. Nobody wants to tell you, oh, we were part of this, or it happened here. They don't want to admit to the fact that there might be some validity to the story, because then they have to take responsibility for it. Then there has to be a possibility or in the case of this movie, there has to be a possibility that maybe the Heike weren't just overinflated egos trying to take everything for themselves. Because what would that say about the overinflated egos trying to hide that fact? So that's my thoughts on the film. I'm going to leave it here. So,
hey, I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and if you did, be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening or watching. If you're listening to it on a podcast platform and they allow you to give a 5-star review, be sure to do that. If you're watching this on YouTube and you really liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and like the video. In addition, if you want to make sure that you don't miss a beat, be sure to hit that notification bell so you know when new episodes drop. But if you're wondering, they drop every Thursday night Eastern time. And on that note, if you really love the podcast and you really love what I'm trying to do here, be sure to give the website a look. That website is bento-box.ghost.io. There will be a link in the description of either this podcast or this video. It'll also be linked in the description of the entire podcast on the information page. It'll also be linked in the description of the YouTube channel. So there's plenty of ways for you to get to that website and check it out. If you want to follow me, my social links are also listed in the footer of that page. So once again, go over there to find that stuff. But I hope you liked the episode. I look forward to talking to you next time. But until next time, I have been Alex. This has been Bento Radio, and I'll talk at you later.